Okay, well, looks like we can get started. Welcome, everyone. So this is the SBIR STTR grant workshop brought to you by the Georgia CTSA, which is an NIH-funded funded center that is centered at Emory, at Morehouse, Georgia Tech, and UGA. And our job is to help all of our investigators and learners really foster development of clinical and translational research. My name's Wilbur Lamb. I direct one of the programs within the Georgia CTSA called the Innovation Catalyst. Morgan Greenleaf, who joins me, is the program manager, and we'll let's do some quick intros. Next slide. Okay, so we have a good number of speakers, and we'll have some panel discussions and a breakout session as well for all of you who are interested in SBIRs and STTRs. So let me introduce myself real quick. So Wilbur Lamb, I'm the director of the Innovation Catalyst within Georgia CTSA. I wear a few hats. I'm a professor of pediatrics. I'm a clinical pediatric hematologist oncologist here at Emory. I'm also a professor of biomedical engineering at Emory and Georgia Tech. My own lab is very interested in diagnostics. In regards to this topic here, we've had from my lab two spin-off companies in the diagnostic space that have all applied for and been awarded several SBIRs, STTRs. So my colleagues are on the panel, and I've also been involved in an education-based SBIR as well, that phase 1 to phase 2. And what I'll do is maybe call on some of our speakers to introduce themselves, and then we'll jump right into it. So Dr. Taylor, Bob, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Good afternoon, Bob Taylor. I'm professor of medicine and biomedical engineering, director of the Division of Cardiology and the Emory PI for the Georgia CTSA. And I'll be telling you in a minute or two about my involvement with SBIRs and STTRs.
Great. Let's see. I'm not sure if Dr. Garcia is on, so let's go to Vince. Vince Laterza, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
I'm Vince Laterza. I've spent about 15 plus years in the university tech transfer side, then at least as much time pursuing entrepreneurship. Currently, as it says, Emory, doing some consulting work for Emory in this area, assisting with small business grants. And I do have a startup entity, Razi Pharma, and a couple other incipient ventures that I'm pursuing.
Thank you, Vince. Professor Steve?
Yeah, hi everyone. Steve Stice here. I'm at the University of Georgia, director of the Regenerative Bioscience Center here, but also wear many hats like many people here. And I've been involved in a number of startup companies that came out of technology in my own lab. The most recent, Aruna Bio, and I'll talk to you about our phase 2 experiences, but in NIH, but also have experience in EPA, NSF, and DOD. So looking forward to it. Thanks, Wilbur.
Thanks, Steve. Say, Dr. Lillard, James from Morehouse.
Yes, hi. Hello, everyone. I'm a professor at Morehouse School of Medicine and the Senior Associate Dean for Research, Innovation, and Commercialization. In the latter role, I'm involved in managing our tech transfer office as well, and managing everything from invention disclosures to helping faculty start new companies to compete for these SBIR grants, among other things. Thanks.
Thanks, James. Okay, and I see, let's see, Dr. Menino. Rob, introduce yourself real quick.
Everyone, I'm Rob Menino. I am currently the Chief Technology Officer of Sanguina, which is one of those companies Wilbur was talking about that spun out of his lab that got some SBIRs. So that's what I'll be talking about with you guys today.
Thanks, Rob. Kevin?
Hey everybody, I'm Kevin from the University of Georgia. I'm in, excuse me, engineering catalyst with our startup team over here, which means I manage most of the engineering material science related startups. I also help teach at our I-Core site to really help you build that commercialization plan part of your SBIR STTR application. And I'll be talking more about the FAST grant that UGA's got that'll help anyone within the state of Georgia apply for SBIRs or STTRs by pairing you all with SBIR STTR consultants.
Thank you, Kevin. Erica?
Hi, everyone. Erica Tyberski. I'm CEO of Sanguina. So I work with Rob pretty much every day, running the company that spun out of Georgia Tech and Emory. We've gotten, as Rob said, I think it's 4 SBIRs now. So looking forward to sharing.
Great. Thank you, Erica. So Professor Garcia, Andres Garcia is not on, but he'll be joining us shortly. He's in a PhD defense right now. So Andres is a professor of mechanical engineering at Georgia Tech. He is also the Georgia Tech PI of the Georgia CTSA. So he'll be joining us shortly. And I'll then let Morgan introduce himself and he'll take over from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Wilbur. So I'm Morgan Greenleaf. I'm the program manager of the Innovation Catalyst, which is the group co-hosting this event along with CMDTS as part of the CTSA. And we have a number of different programs within Innovation Catalyst, including an app development program called App Hatchery, as well as a SBIR STTR review service called Biz Grants that we offer to anyone within the CTSA. And with that, I think we're going to move on to Dr. Taylor to give us a brief history of his own experiences with SBIR.
All right, great. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about sort of, I guess give me like 5 or 10 minutes here to tell you a little bit about how we wandered into the world of SBIRs and STTRs, and maybe a few pearls and some things that'll lead you into some of the discussions to follow. So the company that I'm involved with right now is called Microbial Medical, and we make we're developing bacterial imaging agents. And Mark Goodman in radiology and is a co-founder, as is Noreen Murthy, who used to be at Tech and is now at Berkeley. And so I've had 3 phase 1 SBIRs. I've been involved with those out of 4 applied for, and currently we're in the middle of a fast track STTR. Our first SBIR was with a company that was making a laboratory reagent eventually. And I'll tell you, bad decision right there. Not a lot of money in laboratory reagents. But the lessons we learned, I can tell you, when we first started, we said, oh, well, look, SBIRs, there's nobody around to help, but we'll figure this out. And, you know, a phase 1 SBIR is pretty few pages, pretty straightforward. You know, been writing grants for 20 years or so, I can do this. And, you know, quite frankly, that was the easiest part, was writing the grant for especially a phase 1. You know, we got some ideas from folks and actually went to one of the NIH sort of online workshops. That was great. But then you discovered the route you had to take to even apply. And you're going to learn about that shortly. And it is not easy. It takes several months to be eligible to apply. And that actually made us miss the first deadline. So we actually missed the first grant deadline, which is always a sin, right? And we missed it because at the end of the parade of application materials at that point, and I don't know whether it's still that way, but you have a document that comes from the NIH to get formally enrolled, and so that you can submit grants, and you sign it and you have to fax it to them. And so in this day and age, yes, sort of like strapping it on a dinosaur, as they used to say on The Office, right? And to a signature. So we actually missed our first deadline because of this long prodrome of stuff you got to do before you can even apply. The next 2 went pretty smoothly. I think the things I learned about through there is that you want to take back every bad thing you've ever said or thought about your Office of Sponsored Programs or your research administration, because there are a lot of complicated rules. It's gotten easier now. It used to be a lot of craziness with what size and names of PDFs you could upload, but that's all gone. It's a little bit easier now. But the rules are complicated, opaque, and the response from, particularly from NIH, is not great. You know, the help desk, or until you're actually funded, boy, there's not a lot of good communication back. And so it takes a lot longer to do these grants than it does the typical academic grants that you write. They wanted me to talk mostly about this last STTR that we have. And again, this is a small molecule for imaging bacteria. It's a pet agent. So we started with a phase. So we'd had two phase ones. And so we wrote a phase 2 STTR. So an STTR, as you'll learn to go over in a few minutes, is largely based in the academic partner. Biggest chunk is there. And so we submitted that. We thought it was great. And it got as trashed a grant as I've ever seen. Just a brutal review. And the sort of bad part is they were actually right. Because we actually didn't even have our IND quite yet. We had, sort of were getting there, but we didn't even have it. And so we had no business applying for a phase 2 STTR. And so really wasn't much of a grant. And, they were right giving us a terrible score, i.e. triage. So we did speak with the NIH and finally got a good program officer who was extremely helpful. And that's the other thing is program officers can be helpful. Like everything else, there's sort of a mixed bag. And so we talked to her and she said, you definitely need to write this as a fast track STTR, where your first phase is the final chemical and manufacturing controls and get your IND, and then the rest can be your first in man trials. So that's great. So we wrote that and we worked hard on that. And the other thing we took advantage of that point too is to enhance our commercialization plan. We got some extra support from the NIH, as you'll learn about in a minute, to do a market analysis, and had a company to do a market analysis for us, which really helped our commercialization plan. So we thought we had written a pretty good fast track TTR, and we got a score. And that time our score was 32. It was not fundable. The cutoff was 30, and we were at 32. So we thought, well, that's not bad. We've all gotten grants that are close, but no cigar. And, so let's go back in. And so we resubmitted and we got a 45. So we thought we answered everything they said. And we got a worse score. And the biggest complaint we got on the worst score was one of the reviewers said, you only had toxicology in one species and you have to have 2 for the FDA. Well, that reviewer was wrong for imaging agents. That's true I believe, for most small molecule therapeutics, but for imaging agents, that's not correct. You need 1 species. And I talked to the NIH and they said, yeah, you're right, but oh well, too bad. You got a non-fundable score. And then about a week later, this was the end, getting sort of in the summer, and the NIH came out and they said, oh, we've dropped the funding level to 30 for STTR. So that's the cutoff for 30. So I called up the program officer and I said, aha, so our first score was 32. So are we funded now? And he said, no, because you resubmitted and got a 45 and that score takes precedence. So no, you're not funded. You have to resubmit. So we did a de novo application and got basically took the same thing, turned around, sent it in, and got a 38 with a 35 cutoff. And so I said, okay, this is our 4th submission, maybe whatever. And so we asked for, they really asked for a couple of things, but one is they wanted greater detail on our toxicology studies. And there are very specific tox required for imaging agents. And so and they specifically said, please attach a copy of your tox report in the appendix. So that's what we did. We made minor changes to the grant, sent it in with a tox report attached, and we were administratively disallowed for stuffing because they said that was inappropriate material to put in the appendix. So our grant never even made it to study section on that submission. So, and that was mildly really saved me angry, needless to say, because they had specifically asked for that and we put it in exactly where they told us to put it. And then the NIH said, oh, too bad, that's stuffing. And so then we resubmitted, this is number 5, and that was funded. And so we're in our phase 2 now of the fast track and moving through it. So I think a couple of lessons from this. One is you got to stick with it. 2, there's something called death by SBIR. If this is all the money you're going to get, you're going to die because it takes a long time. It's not fast. It's not agile. And it's as quirky as any other grant. You get weird stuff like the person complaining about our not having two species when you only need one for an imaging agent, and providing technically incorrect information in the review process. That just happens. We started all of these with some GRA funding, and we had parallel R01s all along. We've been fortunate to have continuous R01 funding all along, which sort of kept the pipeline alive, and we had investors. And so this can't be all you got. It's an important component, but that's not all there is to it. And the other part is administratively a lot harder than just writing a grant for the NIH like you do in your everyday job. So I think with that, I'll just finish my little horror stories of the highs and lows. I mean, right now we're on a high. We got the STTR, we got our IND from the FDA. We're hoping to have our first in man finally 8 years later in January or February, and things are looking good. But it's been a journey. With that, I'll turn it back over to Morgan. Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. I should have titled this The Lows and Highs, more lows than highs in that story. All right, next we're going to move into the meat of our presentation with Dr. James Lillard. If you could go to the next slide, Kathy.
Right.
And so James, you should be able to click and start moving the presentation yourself.
Yep.
And just a question for you. Would you like to be interrupted for questions, or would you like them all at the end?
It does. Yeah, it doesn't matter. I'm open, so they can. I'll kind of have the chat bar open as well, and I'll try to chime in if I can see it. But
okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. And for everyone else listening, you can type a full question in the chat, and we will answer in the chat. Or if you just type the word question and it's appropriate, then we will call on you to unmute yourself and to ask your question live. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Lillard.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to try to give an overview of the program, but, along with covering some of these topics. I want to give you some of my own background, my experiences, what I think you need to do before you seek funding, and some of the important differences of the type of grants you most usually applied for, like R01s or R21s, things like that. Some important differences with this mechanism, the agencies that you can apply to, and how you know when your technology is actually ready for one of these grants. So, part of my background, I've been doing this off and on for 20 years. I'm an inventor, AAAS fellow. I've had funding. I've had 9 different SBIR grants. I've published a lot, and I've reviewed a lot. I reviewed a lot of these applications. I served on at least 2 study sections, and I think that's maybe my first message to you is to, if possible, get involved and volunteer to serve on one of these SBIR, STTR study sections. You learn a lot of grantsmanship, a lot of lessons learned along the way. I think that worked out pretty well for me. Broad background, so a double-E undergrad, immunology, microbiology, PhD, and a little bit of business training. And now I'm doing cancer research, so don't be afraid. So, one of the first stops, I thought I wanted to put things in the proper context, what you need to do to prepare before submitting a grant. I think I first need to discuss just briefly what tech transfer is. So I think it's really got to start in the 80s through the Bayh-Dole Act that allowed universities to file ownership or to patent some of their discoveries. And before that, government held a lot of these patents, and it was a lot of technology sitting on the shelf. And since this enactment, I think there's been at least tens of thousands of companies that have been formed. They rank around 2 per day. And as a result, institutions like ours have products in the market. So again, what do you need to do before you seek funding? First, understand the tech transfer process. Other than money, the other currency in biotech or health tech is intellectual property, right? So you want to make sure you're protected. And it's just a process of, well, the tech transfer process is just making sure that that's protected. And our offices work for, we're promoted or promote recognition of our schools, try to remain compliant with federal funding. It also helps to attract attention of faculty and students, but also patients of ours, right? When you have discoveries like some of ours. It's really important for economic development, and it attracts corporate funding and licensing opportunities. This is looks like a shell game here, but this is something to think about what a tech transfer system may look like. This is what happens at Morehouse School of Medicine. And just follow the numbers here from 1 to 10. Faculty member has a discovery. First they write their R01 or the R21. They publish. They have a key finding that they think could have some market potential, and they usually, hopefully, they'll file with our tech transfer office. Then we go through a process of both scientific and commercial review. We use outside folks to do that, so we're not biased. And then if we decide to protect that discovery or to protect that intellectual property, we'll also do a market assessment and begin reaching out to industry, is often the case, to determine whether there's any interest in licensing the technology. We'll get feedback from industry experts, and eventually that makes its way back to the inventor or discoverer, and then bounces around again, and we go through these iterations several times. And it may vary by laboratory, by institution, but we've had kind of mixed, maybe 50-50. Sometimes we're fortunate to find a home for the technology. Oftentimes we have to work with faculty to help mature the technology further through the SBIR STTR program. Just briefly, there are a number of types of patents, and I think for most of the things that we do, we're in the utility patent space. So it's processes, composition of matter, maybe how you manufacture things. Now, but what's not patentable are things like, I don't know, sequence of a natural occurring gene, let's say. So any resulting laws of nature, right? But also, which you must be careful of, this is the take-home message, that information that ends up in the private domain, like something, an abstract you may have submitted, a publication recently accepted before you file a patent, it's going to count you out. So you have to be very careful about that and work with your tech transfer offices. So again, so public disclosures are things like, again, presentations like this one, publications, abstracts, thesis, other patents, right? And, a number of things. It's really a relatively easy step to put together a provisional patent application. It's almost like, it's to be as little as an abstract. Hopefully you have a lot more, but that can be done at your tech transfer office. And then what they'll do 12 months later, during that period, actually, you'll complete additional experiments, read more data, and then you'll have a nice, strong, non-provisional application that's filed with the USPTO or PCT application, and eventually ends up in the public domain, and the race begins. So now, there's somewhat of a dream here in the bitter reality that Dr. Taylor kind of alluded to. So in the best of situations, these are supposed to be compass, like we're a lens we're looking through. So tech transfer office like mine, well, let me start from an academic scientist perspective. They'll have a discovery, and they want to disseminate this new knowledge, and they run to the patent office, and I've got this well-oiled, well-financed machinery that I can get them patented, and then together we go and work with, I don't know, pharmaceutical companies, or will hurry up and start their own company, and this kumbaya movement, and we have all this, we sharing all the value, and everything works out well. But I don't think that's necessarily the reality. The reality is more, there's often some misalignment and competing motivations of everyone involved. So on one hand, the scientist is geared towards discovery and disseminating that information. It's publish or perish. However, I'm running behind them saying, stop, don't publish yet. We've got to manage this process and slow them down, because I need to do some market assessment, and, wait before you send your paper in, okay? Pharma is historically has been more interested in later stage innovation. So that does save us place for smaller biotech firms that could benefit from the SBIR STTR process. But this is some of the things that we manage, and you'll be managing in this journey. Okay. Now, briefly about the different cultures associated with I think academic and industry, R1, for example, or an SBIR grant application. And I just echo it, I repeat myself, but disseminating knowledge, academic culture is more open-ended. Grant can go on and on. I can get grant dollars and can often go into a different direction. In research is actually quite unpredictable, which is fun. And you have a lot of autonomy there, which is great. And our goals are typically more long-term oriented, big picture, career, thinking 20 years ahead sometimes. And depending on the department or institution, may not be well incentivized for commercialization, right? But on the other hand, in industry, it's things, not dissemination of knowledge, but you need to keep things kind of close to vest. You've got really specific objectives and deadlines, because you're developing something. You've already made the discovery. Now you're trying to rush to market. So it's really important to stay on task. And obviously, the shorter the better, because time is money. Again, back to the dream. So we hope that the discoveries move to a new company, for example, and it's licensed from a place like Morehouse School of Medicine. Eventually they raise capital. Maybe they use SBIR, STTR programs, whatever they can. It sends back dollars and equity to Morehouse, and we have all these resources in place to kind of move things along. This is kind of more nuts and bolts, if you will. In academia, we get a lot of funding from NIH, for example, fund our academic laboratories. It works with tech transfer offices that manages the whole disclosure process. And then what often happens, we burp out a new company that's aligned, well, hopefully closely aligned with school and the faculty, and they do a better job of perhaps working with pharma and securing investment from different firms to move the technology along. Now, reality, maybe that's true for, I would say, the first, that technology creation phase, but then we quickly enter the valley of death. And how does, capital fills that gap or that gully there, but we hope to navigate that valley of death through maybe contract research agreements, licensing, forming a company, getting capital, investors in. But what's really important and is often overlooked program, non-dilutive financing from the SBIR STTR programs. And that's really what I want to talk about. So SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research Program, STTR, Small Business Technology Transfer Program. So Both are set-aside programs from a small government with the sole intent of commercializing a discovery. Now, as you can tell here, all SBIR programs combined across the federal government is around $3.3 billion annually, right? And about a tenth of that for the STTR program. So that kind of gives you your first hint, I think, again, but maybe I shouldn't say that. Maybe I should say that depending on the agency, an SBIR program, typically you have a higher chance of getting funding. And there's also more of a commitment made by that company, by that entity. Perhaps that's why that's justified. Another requirement, your company must be for-profit, US owned and operated, and can have more than 500 people. Work has to be done in the United States, and you're focused on really development, less research, more development, and commercializing the technology or service that you have in mind. There are essentially every government agency has a program, something like it, and I have some of them shown here. In the blue boxes are those that exclusively, they only participate in SBIR programs, but in green, they do both, okay? And you can see NIH, it's under HHS, so they do both SBIR and STTRs, as well as NSF, which a lot of us have funding for, I believe. See, the point I wanted to make here, some agencies, they manage this program through contracting mechanism, which are a little different. NIH does both. Different from a grant, a contract, you've got these well laid out plans. It's typically really focused. The topic areas are provided by the agency. There's more of a procurement process where you have to invoice after completion. So sometimes in some events you may need some upfront money. But for granting agencies like NIH and NSF, it's very similar to what you're used to, and you can even invoice or do drawdowns against your account once awarded to help meet the objectives of your project. This is something to keep in mind. A little more detail here. The top programs obviously are the Department of Defense and NIH or HHS, 1.8 to 1.1 billion a year. NSF, a lot of you work with, is around 200 million per year. It's quite nice. These are FY19 numbers. Maybe someone else has some other figures for us, but so I have one question popping up. Does the SBIR STTR mechanism allow for development of mobile health apps? Absolutely, absolutely. One of our faculty at Morehouse School of Medicine, Dr. O'Feely, has a phase 2, I believe, is funded. All right. Yes, see. Yeah, so let's talk about some important differences between the two programs. Actually, both permits partnering, but the STTR absolutely requires a nonprofit research institution partner, like your school. Now, for the principal investigator on the SBIR side, they have to spend more than 50% of their time at the small business. So obviously that would prevent some of us, like myself and maybe Dr. Taylor, from being a PI on an SBIR, but we can certainly serve as a PI on an STTR, right? Because we're part of the nonprofit academic institution. There's also this work requirement, meaning how much of the work has to be completed, how much of the budget goes to the company versus a partner, okay? So for the SBIR, the company has to, the company can contract out as much as 33% of the award, and a lot less, and 50% of a phase 2 award. The requirements for STTR is a little different, more lenient. There's actually, you have to, it's more of a minimum requirement for the research institution partner, and a 40% minimum for the small business. So there's a little more wiggle room there. Now, but I told you before that the bucket of money you're competing for is a lot more dollars in the SBIR program than STTR. So, you know, you should talk to your program officer depending on which one you would like to compete for, because it really varies in terms of their funding rates and what they have available. I recall one application where we were thinking of an SBIR because of this scenario, actually called the program officer. And they said, well, hey, you know, you need to apply for an STTR because no one applies and we always have to send the money back. It was some story like that. So keep that in mind. Now there are 3 phases to these awards. Phase 1, 2, and 3, discovery, development, commercialization. Now, if you look at the instructions, they really encourage you that, okay, you can only spend $150,000 for your award, and need to be done in 6 months. But the reality is, again, you know, I've sent in phase 1 awards that exceed $350,000 in a given year, and it's taken me a year to complete, and that's quite all right. Similarly, the cap is supposed to be more like $1 million for a phase 2, but they can also exceed up to 1.5 without justification, and more if you need it. There are these bridge programs, depending on the agency, where there's a commercialization stage where they'll help you partner and better define your exit strategies and work. And they have relationships with industry if you don't have them already through your efforts. Yeah. Some of the questions. Yeah, I guess the slides will be made available. Sorry. All right. More about the process. Dr. Taylor made some good points here. These first few steps, actually, you know, it's important to focus on that. You know, you gotta set up a small business entity. You know, sometimes we at Morehouse School of Medicine, we don't do that. We use a small outside firm called NeoBiz Solutions, and I'll also put that in the contact information. And they make the new startup entrepreneur's job a lot easier, because it essentially serves you as your sponsored programs office, like the same one you have and benefit from a university. Now, not all of our schools will provide that service for startups. It varies. Morehouse does not, so we use a third party like NeoBiz Solutions. So you know, as you develop your grant application, simultaneously you need to to register your company. It's incorporated. You sign shares, and then there's these government admin steps you have to take, like registering for DUNS number. Well, you know, your tax ID, EIN, DUNS, SAM.gov, grants.gov, ERA Commons, and register in a Small Business Administration. And you have to. Those things have different deadlines, and your passwords will expire. So you have to keep a close track of that. And it also takes a fair amount of time. I'm not sure, it varies from a month to 6 months I've seen. So you have to get a good lead time beforehand. And you're constantly surveilling different, the SBIR and STTR omnibus. There's also different requests for proposals that you can keep track of to see if there's a solicitation that fits with your technology. You know, these grants now, fortunately, are submitted electronically through ERA Commons, which sends it through grants.gov, for example. And then after it leaves, it makes it to a scientific review center, and that's separate from the folks that award money to the grant. There's a scientific review center within these agencies that they'll recruit reviewers like myself and others to critique your scientific merit and the commercialization potential of your proposal. Those scores, let's see, maybe, I guess that's maybe 3 months after you submit your application. And then another three months to 4 months, it'll go to council, which is it's kind of a second tier review process. And they kind of give thumbs up or thumbs down based on the goals and objectives of that agency, whether or not it'll be funded. Even if, so there's no, technically they could fund, and I've seen they'll fund, say the cutoff for funding is a 30, meaning anything less than a 30 would get funded, anything greater would not. I've seen them pull applications as high as in the 40s because it met some objective, and so it's also important to keep close tabs with the program officer. So eventually, maybe 3 months after that, you'll get your award notice and you can start using funds for your research. So it could be a 9-month process from start to finish. Yeah, so this is more of the same. It kind of spells out the funding for phase 1 and duration, what happens in phase 2B and phase 3. It's more about what I said, and it's essentially, this development, refinement, and then commercialization readiness program is also part of that. Now, Dr. Wu, I think Kevin mentioned earlier about, I hope he talks about the I-Corps program. I've actually participated in that, and it does a lot for you. I mean, it really puts things into perspective, some of those reality arguments that I was discussing. You're really immersed in your field or your product, and you talk to customers. You'll talk to oncologists maybe that may use your drug you're developing, or pharma companies that may license the technology from you. And eventually, it really gives you significant impact related to your phase 2 aims, and gives you a laser focus for what you really need to do to take your product to market. So I highly recommend, after completing a phase 1, or possibly even using some of the Georgia Research Alliance funds, participate in the I-Corps program somewhere. Okay, that's it for me. I don't know if there are any questions, or I can.
There was one question that's worth voicing over, James, which is about the amounts. It's a little bit confusing that the amounts listed, the official amounts are $150,000 in 6 months, when in reality, I think it's often more time and money. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Right, and I like my colleagues to chime in too, but oftentimes I seldom, out of our shop, we've seldom submitted something as little as 150,000 for phase 1, especially if we're developing trying to get proof of concept or other for a drug, let's say. You just need a lot more to do it, and our applications typically in the range in the 300s just for phase 1, and it takes about a year to get everything done. Similarly for phase 2, the 1 million limit isn't always the case. It's often sometimes over 2 million. And maybe my colleagues can chime in.
Yeah, this is Vince Laterza. James, first, I appreciated your comments. I thought you did a nice job of setting the table for us. Second point is, my knowledge of this area, unfortunately, is pretty limited to NIH. But as far as NIH, there is, some guidance that you can get if you go to the very back of the omnibus solicitation. there's a section called special topics, and the SBA, Small Business Association, has pre-approved several topics for each institute, and they list those topics. And if your project is in there, then you know you can get more than the published 225. I just know from experience that at NIAID, it's 400 for certain projects. It can be 600,000 if it's a 2-year project, even a phase 1. NINDS actually has one for a drug discovery effort that's 700,000 for a phase 1. So yeah, don't, at least for NIH, don't settle for 150. There's usually a better bigger pot somewhere if you nose around and look. I can't say for DOE or NSF, unfortunately. It's not my area, so.
This is Steve Stice. I can jump in and say that I agree with everything that's been said. Always good to talk to somebody at NIH to say, this is the type of study we're planning, a program officer there, and sort of run by what it might cost. We've actually received about $5 million for one phase 1 and phase 2 together, combined. So it's definitely worth it to go above that budget line for NIH. Our experience with NSF and EPA is totally different. Our interaction, at least, has been that they were very strict on those funding lines. So it does depend on the agency.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Lillard, for that intro and setting the context. Next, we are going to move to a presentation by Vince Laterza. And before we go to that, I'm remiss in putting a slide together, but the agenda for today, I've just put in the chat, that rough agenda that we're going to be following. And just 2 things to highlight. One is we'll be taking a break at 3:15. So if you're itching to take a break, that's that time. And at the end of the presentations, the formal presentations today at 5 o'clock, a few of us will be hanging out afterwards in some breakout rooms. So if you want a more casual conversation or networking opportunity, we will be here as well. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Vince.
Okay, thanks, Morgan. Okay, I have control. Looks like I have control here. So I am going to get to my background a little bit. I gave some openings, but more in part 2. I divided this talk into 2 parts. So part 1 is a little bit more, I would say, conventional wisdom, and I've drawn on a lot of sources. Again, mostly NIH, because that's the area that I've spent my time mining for dollars. And then in the second part, I will talk a little bit more about some of my personal experiences and tactics for overcoming barriers. So the view from way above, the difference between an R01 and a small business grant. And again, I'm not as experienced with R01s, but I gather we're supposed to do great science to advance great science with an R01. With a small business grant, you want to do great science, but you're also going to do development work. And your goal is not limited to science. Your goal is to create a commercializable and a beneficial product that will benefit patients and customers. So in terms of this this diagram at the top, I actually borrowed this from the VIC, which is an investor network, which kind of validates that even people who are professionals recognize that these programs are a great place to get started, to get proof of concept, get proof of principle. And as I mentioned, the R01, it can be directed toward a product or some sort of a service, but it's not necessary. But the small business grant has to be. And I would recommend to everyone who's going to sit down and try to write a phase 1 small business grant, try to make a chart. of this nature in terms of a beginning point and an end point as to the product that you're envisioning. Even if you're not able to do it because you don't really have the experience yet, I think getting this mindset really helps in terms of your success and making the transition into the emphasis and sort of the atmospherics of the small business world, grant world versus the R1. And I also want to say, it sounds like a challenge maybe for someone who's mostly been doing academic work, but you guys are the A team, you guys and ladies. You can see from NIH's own statistics that the people who have the most success with small business grants are people who have successfully won R01s. And that's because you understand the grant process, you understand how to put together proposals, you understand project management, and you're also, elite learners. So you can move into other areas and pick up the things that you need to pick up. So here's some pearls from NIH that I've gleaned. I've tried to curate some of these things, but I think James mentioned, and maybe Dr. Taylor, that he attended a webinar or seminar. NIH at least has some really great offerings, and I would suggest that you look into those, and I'm sure you're going to get some website directions out of my slides and some other folks' slides to give you a starting point if you don't have one. But you might ask, well, who's reviewing these grants? And a big difference is that in the study section, they're trying to get at least 25% of people from small businesses. So there'll be that perspective in the section. The other thing is to don't take for granted that you only have one institute or one agency. There may be others, and you may want to consider shopping, so to speak, because different institutions may be better fit for your technology, or may have more of a bent toward funding, say, devices, whereas other institutes don't fund as much device work. So there are 40 different panels, and they review about 6,500 small business grants per year. And in terms of the commercialization aspects, that really goes to the significance of your work. And we're going to talk a lot about the aims and the milestones, because that's something that is very significant, and it probably is one of the biggest differences between an R01 and a small business grant. So the milestones or your aims really goes into the approach in terms of impacting the score. You don't need preliminary data, but in my experience, it definitely helps. So I haven't seen that many that are funded with no preliminary data. And what are their reviewers are looking for? So they're really looking for a product, obviously, and you need to explain that and articulate it. And you need to explain how your product is different from the state of the art, and how you're really going to bring an improvement, and how it has commercial potential to become a more marketable project. And I would say that a lot of this would be a good outline for your significance. If your significance section addresses all these in a convincing way, every bullet point here, then it's probably a pretty decent significant section. So for the abstract, you want to, again, define the need. And how do people do that? Some people might use epidemiology. If you're developing a system to a clinical decision system, you might point out errors or shortfalls or knowledge gaps that clinicians have that cause issues and that your system addresses. And it's not really enough, as I say, just to say so many people have this disease and my drug targets this disease. You really need to say so many people have this disease and these are the current therapies, and XY population is not benefiting, and I'm going to address that. So you need to, again, always keep in context what's there now, as opposed to just a vague need. And you have to make the description of your technology clear and how it fits in, and also the commercial potential of the technology. And I think, well, you're going to hear from people who've been on review sections, and I've heard it said that a lot of the secondary reviewers might not look at anything other than the aims page. So that puts a lot of emphasis on your aims page. And I would say the first half of it should really be a nutshell of your significance and your innovation. And again, the significance is really you're setting the state of the art. It might be a problem solution formulation that this is a, I was involved in a hemophilia company, and we were trying to tackle the problem of kids, infant boys or very young boys developing antibodies against the first line therapy. So we would say there's so many cases of hemophilia around the world each year in the major markets, less than so. And out of that, so many kids develop these antibodies, and this is the problem that they have. And our technology is going to address that problem and eliminate that. And that will have significant impact on treaters, the patients, of course, their families, and the economy. And then the innovation really drills down and explains what the other therapies are, and then, or diagnostics, or whatever the state of the technology is, and what's your difference. You can tease a little bit more of the how. For example, in my case, well, we're going to give them a therapeutic product that doesn't catch the attention of the immune system in the way that the current one does. So they're not going to be as likely to reject it. And then you can tease the reviewers a little bit about how you do that. And if you have a tidbit or a nugget of preliminary data that points that you're moving in that direction, that can make it a lot more exciting. Key description of the product is important. And yeah, I think also portraying the before and after world of whatever market or indication you're impacting. This is the situation now, and this will be the situation after my technology is fully developed. So again, from some of these NIH workshops, you can see the NIA formulation of this. And one thing that's interesting, it's getting a bit repetitive, I understand that, but they talk about the relevance to the Institute's mission. So that's something you might want to make sure you have a couple sentences about that, how it's going to push the Institute's mission forward. And I want to point out that all these things can apply to clinician support systems, or IT, or software, or those types of devices. So this is something about the aims that maybe I didn't see in the NIH materials, but I think you should also, again, get oriented as to where you are in terms of your development of your technology, but also orient the reviewers as to where the project is. Because if you don't know where it is yourself, and you don't orient the reviewers, they're going to have difficulty understanding the significance of this project in moving the technology forward. So I think you need to make an effort about doing that. And again, I'll give an example, but it's very important to be crisp in defining the milestones or the advances you're going to make, and also assessing and measuring how you're going to make them. That's something that I see. The failure to do that is something that I see in many reviews of small business grants. And again, this may reflect a difference between an R01 type purpose and culture versus a small business grant culture. Most of the institutes will encourage you to send your draft aims weeks before your submission. And I would encourage you to do that. And then you can have a Zoom with the program director, and they'll go over those aims with you and give you some pointers about how you can improve them, or where they see shortcomings. And that's extremely advantageous. So you should definitely do it. So let me give you an example. Let's say hypothetically someone's working on a new vaccine. RSV there's no vaccine for that. And they have a couple constructs. They've been doing research for years now. They narrowed it down to 2 or 3 constructs, and they want to make a couple final tweaks and test efficacy. That's aim 1, is to make some final tweaks and test efficacy. And then aim 2, they're going to make safety assessments. So it's very clear in their mind what they're doing. But when they go to write the grant up on the first page of the aims, they say, we'll do the efficacy testing in aim 1, and then we will take the one that has the best overall profile and advance it to aim 2. That will usually get torn apart. What the reviewers for a small business grant are really looking for is something like, there is nothing approved. There are 1 or 2 in clinical trials now. Those 1 or 2 showed in preclinical studies in mice that they could mount this level of an immune response that neutralizes this concentration of RSV virus in these systems. We will not advance something further unless we can show superior efficacy over those constructs. Now that puts you in a spot, because you've got to show that you can do that. But that is really what they're looking for, as opposed to advance the one with the best profile. That they're not that excited about that. So going back to the sections and kind of weaving back in, again, to reiterate, the significance is really about against the current state of the art. It's not against, many people need this, and it's obvious that the cancer is a horrible problem. You have to be more granular than that and explain within that, what's going on in the field and how you're going to have an impact. And that's really where the pay dirt is for the significant section. The approach, I think the big difference between an R01 and a small business grant is in the approach. You can have superstar scientists, but depending on where the project is, and that's why it's very important to have this in your mind, where you are along the development path. The superstar scientist may not have all the expertise that's needed to get that project done. So you may want to have some consultants on board as part of the project and get letters of support from them. And then, with the approach, again, it should be this milestone based, or this moving down the conveyor belt, so to speak, from point A to point B to point C. Ultimately you're hoping to get to Q, but you're going to show in this project how this moves you down the path toward the ultimate project. The innovation, again, is really the secret sauce, and how your technology differs from what's gone before. Now, on a phase 1, you don't need, and on H side, for phase 1, you don't need a commercialization plan. You do in phase 2, you need a 12-page plan. I think there's a section about that. But you should mention in your significant section, for sure, as James alluded to, the intellectual property status, and also something about the market potential, and maybe about your strategy. We anticipate that we will be able to license this technology at a certain point, or we anticipate we're going to seek institutional financing. It doesn't have to be elaborate, but try to give the reviewers the impression that you're thinking about this in a serious way and what's coming next in terms of commercialization. So you might wonder, I go to all this work, and we heard that twisted, tortured tale from Bob Taylor about how long it took him. But looking, zooming out and looking at the big numbers, here's 2 years data for the STTR phase 1. The success is roughly 20% for phase 1. And then for the phase 2, it's a good bit higher. And that's where the big money is, of course. That's $1 million a year for 2 years. And so that would be north of 35% would be the success rate for that. And you'll see that the SBIR numbers are pretty close. And that's counterintuitive in a way, because the SBIR pot is much bigger than the STTR pot. But as James mentioned, there can be happenstance within certain institutes that they may get more submissions for the STTR or the SBIR, and it's a set aside, so that money, you know, has to be spent. Now, that said, my experience and perception is that these programs are both getting more competitive rather than less competitive, and maybe that's because there's so much pressure on the R01 side. I don't know, but you know, I think the days of really, you know, kind of mediocre scores getting funded because there's no other takers, those days are vanishing, if not gone. So let me move into the, well, first, Morgan, if you want, I'm happy to take questions as to anything that I've said, because I did kind of move quickly and said a few things, but otherwise I can move forward.
I don't see any questions in the chat, actually. Just as a reminder, you can put a question in the chat. We'll answer it there. Or if you have a question and you want to unmute, you can just type question and unmute yourself after you get called on.
Okay, thanks. So I have walked the walk and been doing this for a long time. You can see on the left the entities. I've been involved in a series of startup companies as a co-founder. Someone might say I confounded a couple of them, but I like to think that some of them were reasonably successful. Octogen actually did early stage work on an approved drug, and we don't have many approved drugs that actually came from Georgia, so I feel pretty good about that. Abiome was recently acquired. That's a UGA company, merged into another company, so it didn't fold. You know, it hasn't had a meteoric rise, but it's still there. And Neurop has a phase 2 ready drug. We're hoping they'll get some financing for that. And James knows a little bit about the haplomic story. He helped me land a few grants with that one. And then I had an opportunity to go and work at Georgia State for a while, and I brought those skills to the startup entrepreneurial folks there. And I'll have a shout out to Jenny Yang if she's on here. And if she's not, I would say that everyone at Georgia State should seek her out, because she's the guru in the area. She's had a lot of success in winning small business grants, and her husband also with Proda. Those were some really nice phase 2 awards that came through from NCI. And then another small business that I helped Dr. Sang-Moo Kang get going at GSU. And then lately I've been, doing this assistance program with Emory, and I'm pleased to say that we're starting to put up some pretty good scores. I organized a company called Razi just to lower the bar for people to file. And, based on what Bob Taylor said, yes, it's a real difficult hassle to get the company set up. So I handle that through Razi. And so I'll disclose, have one that has a 39, which is a pretty 29, excuse me, which is a pretty borderline score. So maybe that'll squeak through. And then I have to really take my hats off to the group from Seneca because they did a masterful job at putting together a fast track, which is an ambitious grant, as Dr. Taylor knows. And they got a very competitive score on their first submission. So that's a very exciting, and that's clearly a paradigm shifting type of technology. It's going to change the way clinicians dealing with really complicated blood cancers diagnose the situation, because the program is just really exciting. And it in my mind, it literally can look into the future and kind of figure out what's going on in someone's body once their body is subjected to various potential treatment combinations. So it gives a sneak preview to the physicians. It's really cool. So let me go to some of the more practical points. People are sitting there saying, "Oh, I'm just an academic scientist. How do I get started?" Well, if you need a PI, consider the STTR route, because you can be the PI. And then it's been the last several years, they're allowing that you can switch tracks. So if you like the downstream programs for the SBIR side, you're not impaired by starting with the STTR, and it's a good place to start. need a company scientist, I would suggest considering a postdoc because they're usually trained in the technology. And if your university has reasonable policies, the postdoc should be able to do part-time work for the company and still hold their university benefits, which I think is very important to protect them from medical insurance and retirement and whatnot, because a small company can't usually offer that. You don't know anything about business or marketing. Many universities have access to business databases, although the faculty don't know it. So if you ask your librarian, your reference librarian, do we have any business databases? You might find out that they do. The tech transfer offices can sometimes connect you to those databases. And I know GSU has some good ones. So I would encourage anyone from GSU to talk to the great professionals in your OTT and get connected with that. And also you could talk to MBA students and see if they're interested in getting in helping with your company. And you might set up a formal program with someone who's teaching in the business school. And as James said, James talked about I-Corps, and this slide just gives you a list of all the agencies, or many agencies, and their applicant assistant programs. So it's a portal, at least for the NIH side, where you can contact different people and kind of get plugged in to what they have. And let me talk about another really exciting grant, and it tells me that NIH is getting more and more sophisticated. So this grant is ideal if you have a postdoc who knows that they want to go into industry, because what it is a fast track, and it has a dual purpose. It's developing a technology like any other fast track would, but it's also developing an entrepreneur, because the point of the grant is to identify a postdoc who's committed to going to industry. And then during the phase one, the postdoc is in the lab at the university, but is the PI and gets mentored and trained, with the principal scientist in the lab, the university investigator, and also mentored and participates in the I-Corps program. And then, subject to meeting the milestones that the fast track always requires, that person would then move out into the company and become the PI there, and have their first actual immersive experience in industry. So it's a very interesting new program, and NIA has something similar, and it'll be interesting to see if it gets traction and if it's continued to be offered. Another thing that you should do is, don't try to be the Lone Ranger when you're an academic scientist. I know academic innovators have a strong tradition of being independent because they have to seek their own funding and keep their own labs going, and a lot of do it yourself, which is admirable. But if you're into areas that you really don't have much experience in, you don't want to waste a whole lot of time with intellectual property or regulatory issues. You should seek out some help, and you usually can get connected through your tech transfer office or other resources. Pardon me. If you don't have a budget, and most startups don't that are phase one stage, Georgia Research Alliance can help you. And I found that a lot of vendors are eager, especially the larger ones, CROs and whatnot, to give you quotes and give you some material that you can put into the approach section, and then give you a letter of support. And that's all, for free. It doesn't cost you anything. It says if you get funded, then I'll help you in these ways. So let me give you, I have one war story. This is something that happened in the last 18 months or so. We put in a phase one out of the Emory Vaccine Center. And as you've seen, I've been involved in a lot of grants, and I thought this was a pretty strong filing. And I was frankly disappointed with the first review. And I kind of, realized that the situation is one in which we have a relatively new investigator who's an immunologist writing a grant that basically says what certain cancer pathologists are doing is not good. And it happens that there's like a turning point in this area of cancer therapy, and that the current assay, it's clear the writing's on the wall that the current assay is not good. The standard of care assay, although it is the approved one and the one that has been blessed, and it's even if you get into the papers, there's even a rift between US pathologists and European pathologists as to, how quickly they need to migrate on to something else. And they don't want to migrate on, in part because the current assay is a really nice, simple antibody assay. And migrating on would be getting into more complicated genomic assays. So we kind of ran into a problem, I think, of culture shock. So how we got around that is we got a guru to write a letter, pathology guru, saying, these guys are spot on and what they're proposing is exactly right and you should do it. And then we had the company that actually sells the current reagent. There's more than one company, but there's only two or three, one of the dominant ones. And they wrote a letter and said, yeah, our current reagent gives false positives in so many words. Not all the time, but in a certain number of cases. So it would be good to have this technology if it could be pushed forward. And then the same kind of reviewer said, well, you're not, you don't know anything about diagnostics. So how do you even know if you have a good reagent? So we reached out and found a guru who had done testing of an introduced reagent to show that it was performing as well as, the current one, the standard of care. So he knows how to design these studies. And all these people were really interested in what we were doing, gave us a lot of time for free and wrote all these letters for free. And most of them aren't even asking for anything out of the grant. So I think if you have a worthy technology and, you understand it, that it is worthy, if you reach out to the right people who are the experts, they can really help you, and they can help you overcome your lack of credibility or your lack of expertise by just, because you're a 2 or 3 person company and just getting started. So this is my wind up slide. I'll just go through this quickly, the comparison. So the expert team, I would say, make sure you have the development people. And I think for the approach, those are probably the two that are most important, that you, again, have this milestone structure and also know what the tests and things that are needed to move it forward. And if you don't have that expertise in your lab, and you might not, go ahead and get it and, hire a consultant or do a small agreement, outsourced agreement. I have 2 more slides. Morgan, these are optional slides that people can look at on their own. These are just pointing out how there's a lot more money now beyond phase 2 and a lot more opportunities. So at least on the NIH side, there's one CRP program that really allows you to outsource 100% of the money, which solves a lot of problems that we used to have when we got a clinical candidate and now we just need to scale up manufacturing, IND studies. This grant allows you to do that. And then there's this bridge grant that if you can find someone on the cancer side, if you've gotten a phase 2 grant who will match you, they'll give you $4 million. So, look and, seek the money. And as it said before, get on the phone with the program administrators because they have a lot of information that's not so easy to see. Here's some pearls from Ernie Garcia, who's been very successful in this area. Maybe some of you know him, some of you might not, but he developed the cardiac toolbox, which has earned about 50 million in revenues. It's used worldwide in nuclear medicine imaging. And if you just go through, it's an interesting bullet point that he says, for your science, stick to your R01 type chops. So don't leave those at the door, but make sure that you emphasize the commercial potential and also get help. So that's it for me. I'm sorry I ran over.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Vince. That was great. Just go one more slide. We did have one question, and that came from Nicholas, and he wanted to know about keeping expenses in-house versus outsourcing, and what are the rules around that?
Right. So if you get more granular with the 2 programs, STTR, you can do 60% of the work at the university, as much as 60, but as little as 30. For the SBIR, you can outsource 33%. Now, what's interesting is if you're doing what I would call, a bona fide subaward, let's say it's another academic lab that has an animal model up and running, and you want to send your compounds there and get them tested and it's a unique animal model that other people don't have, and it's an academic, blah, blah. That I'm just saying that's like a bona fide subaward. That will not be considered money spent in your lab. On the other hand, if you're sending a compound out for tox assays on a fee-for-service basis, you can spend, let's say that it's a $300,000 award and you're getting 180,000, 60%. You could send 50,000 to a CRO and and put that in your 60% column. So it really depends on the nature of the work, but fee-for-service type work, as long as you're like ordering the assays and interpreting the results and moving the project forward based on that, and you're putting the intellectual input in, then you can spend the money outside your own facility. But if you're going outside for really unique expertise, where people have their own intellectual property or their own unique systems that are developed, proprietary art in their lab and whatnot, that's going to be a subcontract, and you can't put that in your column. That's the way it breaks out.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right, we're running a little bit over, so we're going to shorten this 15-minute break. We're going to come back at 3:30, and we will see you all then.
Can I just follow up on the response as while people are breaking? Yeah. Hey,
yes, absolutely. And someone else, Luis, also wants to follow up, but I wanted to make sure we got the break in.
I mean, I think I understand what you said, but I mean, needless to say, what our company is in the preclinical IND stage, where we've already got an IND filed, and we're seeking funding to try to do what the FDA wants, which, as you know, has to be done at GLP. So we have to outsource, because Emory and most universities won't certify work GLP. So, I mean, it sounds like the company can say that that's being done in-house, because we're getting that data back and using it to assemble our preclinical data package based on what you're saying.
Yeah, I think you could, and it might be good if you have a regulatory consultant to kind of like beef that up, that you're actually running the show. But hopefully you wouldn't have to put a big budget in on that.
Gotcha. So like you budget for your regulatory consultant, who is taking the data done by the CRO and plugging it in, and then you don't say that we're outsourcing this to a CRO. You're just saying this is what it takes to do the project in-house.
Right. Yeah, the only reason I said about the regulatory person is that, maybe a reviewer will say, well, they're saying they're outsourcing, but they've never done anything like this. They don't know how to manage this. It's not really,
I mean, yeah, I know, but it just seems like a contradiction in terms. This is supposed to be to develop a product. Most medical projects require FDA approval. The FDA needs GLP. Universities don't do that. And being able to do your own GLP in a startup seems impossible.
Right, and I think that they'll work with you on that. And also, as I mentioned, if you're into phase 2 or through it, the CRP is designed exactly for this. You outsource 100%, and you don't have to do any gymnastics about explaining why you're outsourcing it.
Louise, I know you wanted to add something or had another question.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, to echo some of the things that Vince talked about, that in my experience, so I'm on my second STTR, but I've also sat on the STTR study sections. And I think one of the biggest things that I see where people go wrong is that they don't discuss the commercialization aspect. So I actually have a section that I put in mine, because the very first thing, if it's a business or a product, They're going to want to have very clear, and I know there's not a specific section in there, but I usually put that right before I get to the approach of like, where is the IP, if there is any, or what is the plan for IP? And the other big mistake that I see, at least scoring wise, is that, and Vince mentioned, but milestones are like key. If you don't have milestones, it's not likely to get funded, in my experience from what I've seen. So usually the way I set my aims up are aim, rationale, hypothesis, approach. But for an STTR, I'll do aim, rationale, milestone, approach. The other thing that's someone that I didn't realize was possible until recently, and I know someone who's done this twice, is that you can actually be the PI on the company side as well as the academic side in the same proposal. I didn't realize that was possible, but I've seen it happen, and I've seen a successful examples of that. So I think a lot of people don't realize you can do that. I certainly didn't realize until more recently. But yeah, the other point that people are bringing up now is about what's going to be done on the company side versus the academic side. And I also mentioned that, like, you don't necessarily, although a lot of people think you need to rent space, and I thought I needed to do that too, but as long as you're either outsourcing, or even if it's all a data analysis from everything that's being performed on the academic side, as long as it's very clear what the company side is doing, I think that's okay.
Let me want to follow up with that. I just want to make sure everybody understands, like, the example she just gave of being a PI on both sides of the equation. You got to be, just from, while NIH or NSF may let you do one thing, your institution may not allow that. So, there's every school, you need to check on your conflicts, conflicts of interest policies when you look at that. Even for being a PI on an SBIR, for example, we proceed with caution, a little caution.
This is Vince, and I'm going to get in a lot of trouble, as I usually do in these situations. But if you look at the Georgia conflict of interest statute, it has this heading that says, it's illegal to do business, with your employer. But if you get more granular and you read what is doing business, it's really interesting, because they make it very clear that purchasing a service from the university is not, NOT, not doing business. Because think about it, if it were doing business, if you work for Georgia Tech and you have a child that goes to UGA, you're purchasing education services from UGA. So I have made the argument, and it's not necessarily well received at some places, that there really isn't a legal thing in terms of state law, at least. Now, there can be, as James said, some antsiness about it, but I think for the STTR, it's rather odd, because the PI is the PI. I mean, in other words, you are the overall PI. So by definition, you are the PI for the company. So I really don't understand why they want, and I know some universities get very excited about it and have these twists and turns, but I think in the end, the agency is going to look to the person who's named as the PI. And if something doesn't go well on the company side, it's still the PI. I mean, that's as I understand it. So I don't really follow, why you can't be the overall PI exactly. Not like I've thought about this at all.
What do you mean you can't be the overall PI? I guess I'm not following.
No, I'm saying that, Louise, by definition, when on an STTR, you are the PI for the company and the university, because you're the PI.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that people should understand is that it is, by definition, it is a conflict of interest. But, having that said, as long as you disclose it, and in some cases, you're probably going to need to create a management plan. I mean, I think, you know, as long as you're thinking about those things, you realize that this is a conflict and you have to disclose and you have to manage it, then, you know, that's sort of our reality.
Yeah,
But
very
there's
well
nothing,
said.
but there's
Very
nothing
well
wrong
said.
with it being a conflict, you know?
Mhm. Yeah,
So,
that's
so
well
I'm
said.
co-chair of the Conflict of Interest Committee, and I can tell you we consider them all conflicts. But then sometimes you have to be at arm's length. So I'm at arm's length from the human studies because I'm not necessary for those. So the PI on our STTR is our business person, and then we have a subcontract to the university, which Mark Goodman's the PI, and I'm actually not listed on the grant at all because I am not necessary to carry out the human studies.
Right,
right.
I have 3:31 on my clock, and so we're going to go on with the rest of our program. As always, good discussion, and you can always put more comments in the chat or unmute. Kathy, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. And then, so we're going to have Dr. Steve Stice from UGA, who is going to talk to us a little bit about phase 2 and specifically the commercialization plan as part of phase 2, as well as a small roundtable discussion about the differences between phase 1 and phase 2 from those who have won those awards. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Steve.
Thanks. And yeah, I think it's really important to have those discussions that we had during the break. And there's a lot of opportunities out there, and I hope you feed into this program. And really, my biggest message is don't do it by yourself. And that's been said over and over again, but you can hear from Bob's experiences and Vince's experiences that it does take a lot more than just writing the grant. The other thing I'll say at the beginning is that as far as phase 2s go and phase 1's relationship is that build that phase 1 grant so that you can accomplish those milestones or goals that you have, because all of the money and most of the money is in the phase 2. So you don't want to put barriers in front of you to get that phase 2 grant. So you want to have something that's meaningful as milestones and objectives in phase 1, ones that will get the study section excited, but also ones that you can actually accomplish, because I think it's much more difficult to get to phase 2 if you have to say, well, we pivoted to something else because phase 1 didn't work. It really, I mean, that can be a disaster and potentially a waste of time for people. Now, there may be success stories in doing that, but it really, you need to set yourself up for success in phase 2, because that's where the big money is, as said. And we got a $4.5 million phase 2 based on success in the phase 1. So that's really important. So the phase 2 is much larger in size. I mean, the research plan is much more extensive. And on top of that is this commercialization plan, which is can be a 10-page document. So, and it really should not be a repeat of the research plan as laid out in the actual research area. So it's really important that you demonstrate that you have the knowledge, you have the team, and you have the ability to take something to market. And I think it goes beyond the capabilities of a postdoc in your lab. And to really be successful, I think in phase 2 is that you need a management team of some sort that has some success, maybe a board of directors, a scientific advisory board, it may potentially, but at least key opinion leaders, what we call KOLs, that can really support what you're doing, not only from the scientific side, but also on the commercialization side. And those people should be intricately woven into your commercialization plan going forward. So that as an overall overarching statement, I think is really important as we go forward. Let's see. So the sections of the commercialization plan, again, outside the research plan, there are these sections in them, and they can be vary in length. Just to give you an idea, we think of the value proposition as being maybe a page long. The company overview can be a page to 2 pages long, including, if you have management and the people involved in it from maybe a CEO, if you have one, but also just really bringing home the idea of how you are set up to succeed in this area. Market, customer, competition analysis. That, I think, is, in my estimation, the meat of the commercialization plan. And in our commercialization plans, they're probably about half of the proposal in that plan. Obviously, you need the strong intellectual property protection, a finance plan as well, and then production and marketing plans. All of those can be half page to page long. But I really stress at the end, the NIH or EPA or NSF, they all want to see how you can make this a success. And success means not only the science at some level, but really how you're going to generate profits or at least sustainability of your company going forward. So the value of the plan is again important. All of these slides I hear from Morgan are going to be available, but all of these bullet points should be hit on at some level. It is not good enough, in my estimation, to say the market is X billion dollars and we're going to capture 10% of it. That really, to most reviewers, say, how do they know that? And so you really need to build throughout this commercialization plan the confidence that this product is going to be successful. And it's not just pulling some numbers out of a review or market analysis plan. So it's been hit on before, important how the product solves or has a benefit, it has a problem that it solves. There's data suggesting that there is a problem. Competitive advantage, and Vince talked about this, that's really important. And then the recent advances in the field, commercial application, really trying to pull in what we would say comparables. So if there are other groups or companies out there that are doing this type of work, what are they doing? Why is this product going to be much more valuable to the end users? So market potential, future works. There is an area to talk about, non-commercial impact, but again, I think that's minimal going forward. But again, if you have a business plan, it'll show in this area, in this section. So the company overview, that can be, a summary of the company, how it came to be, really more to the point of what the competencies are. Of course, why are you the pros? Why are you the best one to do this type of work and make it a success? The size, the history of previous federal and non-federal funding. I think this is really key here. I mean, being successful in SBIRs is great, but as Bob said, the non-federal funding can be very important as well to reviewers, as do they see that, okay, yeah, we're not on an island in funding this company. There are other groups out there, whether it's venture capitalist groups or private investors or a contract with another company that gives it credibility, and that goes a long way, I think, as we go forward with that commercialization plan. Regulatory experience, of course, that depends on the product and whether it's regulated or not. And then how the company plans to develop from a small technology and really be a successful commercial entity, because again, that's what the SBIR STTR program is judged on, and how successful these programs are in bringing things to market and successful companies going forward. So as I said, I think this is really important. The market, customer, and competition. Know the market needs, really identifying who the customer is. It's not, in a therapeutic, it may not be the patient, unless you directly market to individuals, and maybe the docs, and maybe a number of customer bases. So really bring your knowledge forward and how this will actually be commercialized. And you got to know your competition, obviously. That's going to be important. The competitive advantage, as I said, all of these are somewhat repetitive in some ways, but you need to bring different aspects to this commercialization plan. And then considering whether there's a collaboration, partnership. I mean, it's very rare if you're developing, it's very rare if you're developing a therapeutic that you're going to take something from the bench all the way to the end clinical trial. And so I think you really have to consider the steps, as Vince said, along the way to get that product into the arms of patients. And to describe that market and sales strategy, and maybe for a reagent where you will be marketing something, and therefore you really have to decide, well, are you going to market it through a third party, a distributor? Are you going to have direct sales? All of those are really important. And if it isn't evident enough yet, it really should be to you now that you need somebody to help you along with this process. Intellectual property. Many of you will probably draw on your university licensing division for this and describing the technology, but you really need to describe how you will be able to protect this. Granted patents are obviously better than provisionals, but you need to think about, what are the various families of patents you might develop. It very rarely is it going to be just one patent that's going to protect a technology. There are multiple patents that will be filed, whether it's on initial product and then how you might use the product, the various disease states that you might be addressing with it, but really thinking about the whole picket fence that you're going to build around your technology, and that will again bring great credibility to your proposal. And then this Valley of Death has been talked about over and over again. I mean, it really is, as Bob was saying, for his company, same for our companies, is that, you can't really live on the SBIR, STTR financing. It's long, it's drawn out, and you really need to think about how you're going to finance this, even outside the SBIR program, and really looking at different phases. So what are the key milestones that will, in an investor's mind, bring an inflection point that will increase the value of the company or the technology going forward? So really planning this out all the way to commercialization is going to be really important. And those milestones really have to be described succinctly, and the timing in which you expect to make it there. Nobody expects a therapeutic to get to market quickly. So you're going to have to think about, what are those milestones, how long it's going to take to get there, and develop that very carefully. Shorter, of course, for a service or a reagent of some sort. So just thinking that thoroughly through and based on a lot of the instructions and advice you might get from people that know things in this area. And then the production and marketing plan, the product, the place, channels of distribution, promotion, how you're going to promote this product, and pricing. They're going to want you to think about how much this product is going to be, how much it's going to cost. How does that compare to other products that are in this area? And then also, who's going to pay for it? The payers, and understanding how that process works is really going to be important as you draw and develop this commercialization plan. And then the revenue stream, I think I touched on this earlier, is it going to be direct sales, sales through a reseller? You can develop joint ventures with companies to develop this thing, or even to the point of thinking about licensing. But there are a number, this is just put up because there's a number of different ways in which you can generate a revenue stream. If it's a platform technology, could it be used for X while Y is being developed by other funds? There's a number of ways that you can finance things through going forward, not just through bootstrapping it through the SBIR program, but really understanding how you might be able to get income coming in. And of course, all of that brings credibility to you. So if you can do something like a joint venture or a licensing program with a major pharmaceutical company, that would be just really great building. It would be great to build your credibility around those types of activities. And then letters of support, Vince gave great examples on this, but current or potential customers. I've seen letters where they've stated to the point that if the company takes this technology to this point, we'll be able to buy that product or purchase that product from the company. We'll commit to funding various levels. And then venture capitalists have done that as well. It is not easy to get them to commit those types of letters, but if you can get them to do that, that would be very important going forward. So support for projects, again, if you partner with a major pharmaceutical company that's going to take on some of the responsibilities as far as funding the studies that might go into IND enabling studies in the future. So if you can get it so far with the SBIR, and you can start to collaborate and work with other groups that may have much deeper pockets for financing, this can be really beneficial for you, and again, build that credibility. So with that, I'll stop on the slides. We've got some time, and I just reach out to others on the panel here if they have commercialization and personal experiences that they would like to share with the group.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I'd love to invite Wilbur, Erica, and Rob to also join us. And maybe I could even start with you, Steve, with one question from the from your slides there was about manufacturing, specifically around therapeutics. And if you were planning to partner in the sale of that therapeutic, would you need to actually describe how you would manufacture it, or would you just describe sort of that partnership plan?
I think from my own experience, it's both, is that you need to describe how you're going to work with a group, whether it's a contract manufacturing organization. I mean, that's perfectly fine, is to describe how, you know, you'll be able to transfer the technology to a CMO that will move this technology forward, and then again talking about how that might get paid for. But I do think you need to have some knowledge around the manufacturing process. I mean, you don't have to have deep knowledge, but you do need to think about, you know, of course, GMP, and when that you need that, as far as, you know, IND enabling studies, or anything along those lines that may not be necessarily research. You have to demonstrate knowledge in that area, and that might be through the partner that will describe that in your commercialization plan for you. But people are going to want to know how it can be produced, and knowledge around what the cost of the goods are. So what's it going to cost to produce this? And I think one of the things that people often say is that, oh, in my lab, I can generate this product for pennies. Well, I think that's a bit naive, because you don't realize all the costs that are associated with taking a product to the market. Now, to scaling it up, the development costs that go around it, all of those sunk costs that go into it, but then also the marketing and so forth that will go into a product. So just need to be knowledgeable, and that can come through a partnership, but you need to know it at some level.
Awesome. Wilbur or Erica, do you want to tell us about your own experiences?
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. So maybe I'll let Erica kind of talk a little bit about, you know, her experience, our experience, and kind of the phase 1, phase 2 transition. There's a few points I think that are worth really talking about, specifically with the commercialization plan and the lessons learned. And I'll let you kind of weigh in, Erica, and then maybe I'll talk about a couple specific points as well after you.
Sure. Hello again, everyone. We've been very fortunate to have 3 phase 1s. Our first one was an STTR phase 1 through NSF, and we've had 2 SBIR phase 1s for actually 2 different technologies in the same platform space. And when it comes to the commercialization plan, there is no requirement for the phase 1. I tend to talk about it a little bit within the body of the text, fully knowing that the page limits are what they are. Being a concise communicator is one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give you in general plans. But moving into phase 2, one of the really nice things I liked to do with the commercialization plan was almost have an analog of what you did in the research strategy when you talk about phase 1 accomplishments. So in the research strategy, you have this section, you talk about your phase 1, how successful it was, or, you know, exactly what you learned, and, you know, leading into why you're asking for phase 2 development money. I like a similar analog in the commercialization plan as well, on top of everything that was just presented, to show what you've been thinking about in the translation process, even if it wasn't grant dollars that did it, just to highlight that you have been thinking about this the whole time. You're definitely treating this as a business opportunity and a small business. So I really liked that. And this goes without saying for any grant. I think having an image on each page, if you can, something a little bit more interactive, helps a reviewer out. And the more that you can give them something they're comfortable seeing, I think the better. So in our case, we had a half page that was just a commercial, like a competitive table, and it had a little bit of graphics in there. It was very easy to read, almost like a manuscript. You want these figures to stand out. So I found that helpful. One of our stories with this phase 2, it was just awarded in August of this year. And we actually went through, I think it was 3 resubmissions, Wilbur, if I'm not mistaken. And the only reason we were allowed so many is because we had 2 phase 1s. So we actually applied, attached to 1 phase 1, then resubmitted. Then we had a second phase 1 that we could jump to and start another process with. So I guess that was unique for us. But in that, we ended up getting feedback about the commercialization plan and the entire strategy. But within the feedback, we had a lot of comments about competition. So one thing, if you can, be as comprehensive and as detailed as you can in the competitive analysis, because if there's an elephant in the room that you're not addressing, a reviewer will find it. At least that's what happened in our case. Interestingly enough, between the different review sections, we actually had 2 different sets of review people. And one thing you have to keep in mind is that you'll never please everybody. So what happened in the first submission translated very well to the resubmission, but then when we had to switch our attachment to another SBIR phase 1, that feedback didn't translate totally. And some of the reviewers had totally new things to bring up. So just one piece of advice if you're in the resubmission game, but really having an overall commercialization strategy with everything that I believe was Steve touched on, very important. The other thing that I really hone in on is COGS in relationship to the labor attached to it. So I also fell into that same bucket where I'd say, oh, my test will be 25 cents. Look at this. I can do this at volume. It's so easy. But one easy way to get yourself out of that is think about the labor involved. So if you have, yes, cost of goods sold, sorry, that's what COGS means. You think about the labor involved, and that's a really easy way to have the picture start being outlined, right? If you're going to really take this to market as well, think about if you have to have a quality system in place, the right type of setting to actually manufacture what you're doing. So that's just one tip. And I'm sure we can talk about horror stories and successes as we go, but Wilbur, interested in your specific points you want to touch on.
Yeah, thanks, Erica. And maybe I'll say a couple of things that I've seen as a reviewer quite a bit in terms of kind of common mistakes regarding market and competitive analysis. And I think we as academics are prone to this. I've seen this many times and it never goes well, where the investigator, the company says, yeah, in terms of market, we're completely unique. There's no competition at all. Nothing is like what we've done. That's actually a horrible thing, right? Because what you're describing to at least a person with a business background is there's no market, right? So I think that's something I've seen quite a bit, and I think is worth really calling out specifically. Maybe I'll ask Rob to see if he has any lessons learned, at least in the commercialization side. And maybe Rob, we've had 1 or 2 questions from the M Health side. So we've talked some about diagnostics, medical devices, and pharmaceuticals and therapeutics. Anything specific from the M Health, now that this is becoming a burgeoning field?
Yeah, so I think one thing that we really stressed in this document were the development resources and plans that we're going to use. So I think something that kind of distinguishes you from making that jump from a phase 1 to a phase 2 is how you are going to get your back end figured out and everything associated with commercializing an app. Instead of just, I guess at the beginning from old development, you're just trying to get, the tool built, but you want to start thinking about scaling and how to actually bring users into it and how to track them and monitor whatever you're doing to make sure that it's working appropriately and monitor how it's crashing and things like that. So building in that type of development plan and the resources associated with it, like whatever cloud infrastructure you're going to use or whatever third-party software, packages or companies you're going to use to do the tracking and monitoring is really important to make sure you include, and something that you need to think about. And it's kind of a lot of the major challenges I'm dealing with right now, I think.
Yes, ways, in the M Health game, there's some similarities with making a device, right? Just like there's cogs to making a diagnostic test, a medical device. There's similar infrastructure overhead cogs, so to speak, for even M Health platforms, and that's something that's kind of a new flavor in this era of digital health and commercialization thereof. So we're at yeah, Steve, I was going to ask if you had anything to chime in on.
Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention, or maybe it's quite evident from my talk, but getting people to help you. NIH and NSF are very good at trying to find ways to help you be successful. So if they offer you something like a consulting firm like Foresight that says we'll go out and as a third party present your technology to them and get feedback from those key opinion leaders that they find, and you can actually use that in a commercialization plan. So there are a number of ways in which you can get help directly from NIH or NSF beyond finding those consulting firms as well. But just be open to those in the I-Corps opportunities, because those are really helpful things for you in your commercialization plan.
Right.
And actually, there's one thing I want to add to that. I thought of as you were talking, Steve. It's not really, it won't necessarily help you one way or another in getting the award, but as you're building your commercialization plan, I think to maximize your success in actually commercializing and starting to meet the goals of your award, I would suggest bringing as much, if you're in the digital health space, bringing as much development in-house as possible and focusing your commercialization plan on growing and expanding your team rather than relying on third-party firms to get some of these things done. We have run into, and this is from personal experience, right? We have run into some issues doing it the opposite way. So we're kind of finding that we've had to, I guess, redo some plans based on some of those issues. So trying to grow the team and having champions of the technology within your organization is the way to go, from my experience.
Yeah, totally agree. There was not exactly duplication of work, but essentially a lot of rework in having it come in-house to make a more sustainable digital product. So that's a very good call out. One other comment on the actual strategy, and I know that Steve mentioned that you could get a letter of support from venture firms that are interested in you. If it wasn't already said, if you already have investment, definitely include a letter from them. That definitely pushed us over the edge with one of our resubmissions. We actually got investment in between two of them, and we were able to say, look, see, we told you we were going to do this raise, and then we did. So we were able to include that letter. And one other thing too, we also included a breakdown of all of the people and groups that had funded us to date. So in addition to venture funding, which theoretically is the most flexible, we had a whole summary of who had funded us before. So it was just building that credibility that we can handle and use funding responsibly. That's also been a big topic in NIH recently. So making sure that you can prove yourself as credible there too helps.
Great. All right, thank you guys. So I think what we'll do is kind of transition now to the rest of our panel. And this next hour is really about several different topics, but this is where we could take any questions we have, and we'll bring in everybody, and we'll have several themes that we'll touch on. But this is where all of us are ready to answer any of your questions. The first thing we'll do is talk about aspects of the submission process, we can get as granular as you all like in the audience. Feel free to either chat your questions or say question, and Morgan and I will then call on you and we can have our panel discuss. So we'll talk about the submission process. We'll talk about the review process, because many of us have not only served as reviewers, but have also been the reviewee. So we've seen it from both angles. And then finally, some kind of pearls of wisdom, grantsmanship, kind of tidbits we've all kind of bumped into over the years as we've applied. Okay, so it looks like we have our whole crew here. So maybe I'll start off with a question with the process. So something that we've all learned in something we've already mentioned is that, remember, you all are your own OSP. You are your own, grant administrator. So you have to take care of everything. So there's lots of deadlines. So actually, maybe some of our panel could talk about their experience with deadlines and, for example, the DUNS number. You have to make sure you get that. So this is not a grant that you can just decide to submit in a couple of weeks, because you need all this stuff beforehand. Let's see, Erica or Rob or anyone want to chime in on some of the process tidbits, lessons learned?
Sure. I think someone might have said this earlier, but you can very easily miss a grant deadline if you don't start this process pretty early. Our first first phase one was an STTR. And I remember going through all of these things, and we were caught up at the grants.gov phase. And we had maybe 4 days before submission. I didn't realize that these things just wouldn't cascade into one another. Like, it's you actively doing the next set of steps in between each of these. So I had a scare moment because this application was ready to go, and I was actually on the phone with NSF and with grants.gov and somehow managed to get it through the day it was due. But that can very easily go south. So starting it earlier is better. And then I actually have a cheat sheet tidbit as far as submitting an NIH SBIR with the Assist platform. So I think maybe I'll save it till the end when we go through this process, but it saved me when you're literally an hour away from a deadline and you're confused on why something isn't working. So I'll hold that, but I don't know, Rob, do you want to chime in?
I think you mostly covered it. I actually, luckily, never had to get super into the nuts and bolts of the submission process because Erica was so good at it. So I just wrote the documents.
I can throw in a warning for you on the sam.gov. That has to be renewed, and if you don't renew it, there are predatory companies out there that will claim your name, and then you have to go through a process to get that back. So you have to be very careful about meeting these deadlines. So it is critical you follow the rules and you pay attention, and you'll get emails that are very confusing because under public disclosure, the other companies can figure out when your registrations are ending, and they'll send you emails saying, oh, and it looks very official, and it says your SAM is expiring, let us help you, or whatever, and do this. And you find yourself, you're on a commercial website if you follow that, not the federal website. So you have to be really careful about some of these registrations. The grants.gov can lag, and that's not a big issue if you're not actively submitting at that moment. But the SAM one is a pretty tricky one, and you have to make sure you stay current with that, and watch for these fraudulent companies that try to come in and either take your name or charge you money to do what is basically free to renew it every couple of years.
Yeah. It's totally free. So they'll send you things saying, oh, it's for only $89. You get our consultants, and you don't need it. It's not, it's not something you should do. But even if you're in good standing, I get them all the time, Bob. So like, I'll just renew, and then a month later it'll say, oh my gosh, you didn't do something correctly. Like, they're very predatory. I'll just second that.
So this is Vince. I have a couple anecdotes, two trivial things, and one that's a little bit more substance. I think everyone knows that SAM historically has been the the long haul to try to get through of all these gates. But I had a company one time, they sent me something and, you know, it was their address. And I didn't really zero in much on it, just kind of filled it out. And their address was a PO box. Oh, Sam just went nuts. I mean, totally nuts. So then the same company came back with a different address. Well, Sam figured out that was the street address for the UPS office that had the PO box. And then I put an address in for like an incubator, and I got a message saying there are 5 other companies at this address. What's going on? So the address, as trivial as that could be, and you know, you're running a deadline, you're trying to get the thing filed. You have this whole team of people. You've been through it. I mean, it's just excruciating. So something like that is, you know, I would say one area that you can just fall down on. The other area is with Assist. I had a person call me, Emory faculty, obviously very sharp. They're a sub on an SBIR, so the company was putting it in, but I guess the company wasn't totally savvy. But yeah, they're sending me emails, and the deadline is very close. And the issue really boiled down to when they went into the screen for the budgets, like on the STTR, because the subaward is mandatory, they always have the subaward budget available at the top. You know, it's apparent. You just click it and it comes up. On the SBIR, you have to ask for that, like as one of the optional documents. And that wasn't apparent. And, you know, it ended up, there is a website for Assist that I sent to Morgan, and I think we should share it if we can, you know, with all the participants, because it does actually have a user manual. And that the person ended up going to that site and making a call and solved it in like 3 minutes. But there are just things like that that can trick you. And the other issue that's a little bit more substance is human subjects can get pretty complicated. And they can get pretty fussy about that also at NIH. And, you know, there are different tiers. For example, if you're using tissue, that's, you know, can be considered specimens. And if it's de-identified and it was collected for a different purpose, that's fine. But, you know, you still want to put something in about it. But some people just aren't careful. I helped a person doing a contract for SBIR. And the person who drafted the grant said, well, we're going to get blood from XYZ people and, you know, and analyze it for this, but they had nothing about human subjects. But then when I talked to the PI, you know, the person that had written it was a postdoc. He said, oh, well, he doesn't really understand, or she, you know, what's really happening is that this has already been collected and this is, but you know, if they sent that in without that being flagged, that could have raised a bunch of stuff with the reviewers. So I'm just saying the whole area of human subjects is something that, and even sophisticated, smart people in certain situations, like if it's not a clinical trial, but you're initiating collecting a sample, what is it? I mean, it seems like it is human subject. So it gets very, it gets very tricky. And so I just beware of that. Don't think it, oh, well, the day, you know, I'll just fill out that form. Because if it is triggered, there's a whole series of sub forms that have to be completed about the gender and, you know, well, just a series. I can't remember all of them, but sub documents.
Cool. I would say that was mostly horror stories about the experience of going through this process. I'm going to reiterate what Wilbur said. The 2 main things to talk about are that your OSP, your Office of Sponsored Programs, is not responsible for this. You as the company is responsible for this, which is different. And the second is it takes time. So please make a plan to go through all these hoops. I did have 2 follow-up questions related to this this process. And one just is for the group here, which is several people talked about talking to the program officer either at NIH or the other sponsoring group. Can someone on the panel just talk about when in the process they talked to those folks and what was helpful about that process?
I don't mind piping up. It's Vince again. I don't want to be dominating, but I've established a good rapport with a person at NIAID, who I have a lot of confidence in, and another person at NCI. And depending on the situation, you know, what they always say is what they want to see are the aims, you know, for the grant. And as I said during my talk, and I'll reiterate it, you should always do that. And, you know, it's a good discipline for you to have the aim several weeks ahead, obviously, in a final form that you can then send to the program officer. So I would say always do that. But even before, you know, I've like the Seneca people that I was bragging about that did a great job with their recent, you know, fast track. We started talking to the person at NCI almost a year ago, just about there were different programs that we were interested in, and you know, just the nature of the technology, and how much data they had, whether they were excuse me, fast track eligible, for example, or whether it was more prudent to file a phase 1. And I will say, I think it depends on the program director. As I said, at NIAID and NCI, and I think NIA, they have very strong teams. Some of the smaller institutes might not be as interactive, or, you know, as willing to spend the time, but I would encourage it. Try it, you know, and hopefully you'll find a good one. And also you can get some crosstalk. Like if I have a general issue that about, say, an assignment, or, you know, which agency, sometimes I can talk to a colleague in one of the agencies, and, you know, they'll tell me kind of informally about the other agency, or a little bit, you know, I don't think it's any secret, but for example, I've heard that NCI, they have a little more discretion to give a grant, even if it didn't meet the score, if they think it's a meritorious grant. But apparently at NIAID, the policy is it's just stricter. So you get kind of the, you know, insights like that can be helpful, I guess. So I think you should talk to them.
Yeah, I would just reiterate, early as you can and as often as you can. For one example, going into a study section with a $4 million phase 2 without having talked to the program officer before about this and what the budget's going to look like could really be, you know, I know we're not supposed to talk about budgets, but we all do, and really can have a negative impact. And we actually have on the budget justification page, you know, that documenting that it's been discussed with the people at NIH, and particularly one institute versus another, that this is, you know, that they've reviewed and have said they understand that this could be, you know, be more, go outside the typical budget levels for NIH.
I like to talk to the program officer right after scores are released. So if you, maybe it's the grants officer, well, Wilbur, you can help me with exactly who it is, but essentially we've been in that lovely gray area of like plus or minus 5 points from the pay line quite a bit. And it's nice to reach out once we have that score to kind of understand and gauge, you know, if the officer can tell you your chances are very low, you know, we already know. If they can give you any information on that to help guide if you're going to do a resubmission, that's helpful. Do I have the right person though, Wilbur? Is that a program officer?
Yeah, so similar to other grants, you know, before the review process, it's the SRO, the scientific review officer, and then after it's reviewed, it's the program official. So there are some similarities, at least in terms of process, you know, with other more academic grants. But any other thoughts, at least on the submission process, Erica, that you were thinking of?
Oh yeah, there's one thing I wanted to highlight. You know, the 5 registrations that we have outlined in the middle of the slide, they're not just, you know, just because. So in the submission process, there are a couple things that can really trip you up at the end if you haven't put in the time to go into each module, specifically on assist, because some of them are actually fields that you enter within the platform as opposed to attach as a separate document. So especially the human subject section that got a revamp in the past 2 years, used to be that you could include all of this as attachments and attach it and it would go through. Now it's very, very, enter into this field type situation. So I like to validate and check the application for errors and warnings well before you try to submit, a few days before if you can, because it'll actually tell you what exactly you're missing. It's nice to do that before you only have 2 hours to do something, because even if it is just cutting and pasting, it can get really messy if you're not careful about it. So again, the timing is important, but that is a little trick that can help you avoid warnings and errors. And I believe it's errors will trip out the application and that you will not be able to submit it. So you'll see the timeline and the window just go by. Warnings, it won't prevent you from submitting, but think about fixing them. And it's really good about telling you what's wrong. So I would try and do that. And basically, it goes into a phase called ready for submission. Don't worry, you won't accidentally submit. There are many, many, many stopping points along the way. So if you say prepare for submission and check the validation, you can do that and then enter back into not ready for submission. So that was one tip. For the actual submitting through Assist, you have a signing official and the PI. So I don't know, Wilbur, if I'm repeating something, let me know, but they're technically 2 different people or 2 different logins on ERA. There's also someone called an authorized organization representative, which is through the grants.gov platform. So one of the registrations that was made, the AOR and the SO are typically, I guess they can be different people, but for our organization, they've been the same. And essentially when you say it's ready for submission, there is some activity that individual will have to do. So coming from the position of being PI, there's actually somebody that's the person who actually clicks submit. So getting them ready and geared for what they need to do is important. One tip I noticed was the authorized organization rep needs to be assigned through grants.gov prior to trying to submit. So if there's no AOR, it's not going to go through. You need to log into that using your company login that you created in this registration step. You can log in and assign that person pretty quickly. I've had to do it against the deadline. It's annoying and scary, but you can do it. And then your signing official is actually the person who goes in and signs into Assist, says submit, and then there's another check again, because it's never just one check, that then asks for the AOR credentials for grants.gov. Once those are entered and you click submit, that's an actual submission. So that's a lot, and I can try and outline it if you want on this specific nuance, but it is something that's tripped me up on 2 different occasions, even though I've learned from it the first time. So just something to think about.
Thanks, Erica. So that really, again, harks back to the point of you guys, your company, you are your own research administrator, you're your own Office of Sponsored Projects. It goes back to what Bob was saying in the very beginning. You learn to appreciate what they do once you're doing it yourself. So all these nuances and all these very, very non-user friendly processes in terms of uploading, they're all on you.
Awesome. So that's it for process. We're going to move on now. And Erica, if you ever lose a job, I think you have a career as a consultant in this process without any effort.
I wanted to, I'm so sorry. I wanted to mention, I just put something in the chat. Like if I found it was time was better spent as a scientist focused on the science and the project and companies like NeoBiz Solution, or there are others out there, but you may want to consider using someone like that to manage the process of keeping up with all your credentials and submitting your grants, and et cetera, et cetera.
James, while you mention it, that's a great point. Do you have a rough sense of how much these companies would cost and how you would integrate that?
Yeah, some are very expensive. Some want a percentage of the profit or the F&A from the grant. Others like NeoBiz, it's really inexpensive, less than $500 to submit. So and then once you get the award, there's they can help manage the funds and some of the reporting that typically an OSP, Office of Sponsored Programs, might do instead of an investigator. So I don't know, it's been really helpful for our folks.
Okay, good tip. Avoid those headaches. We're going to move on now to, the review process. And luckily we have many folks on the line with us here who have actually seen behind the curtain about the actual review process. And we're not going to go through this evaluation criteria exactly, but I wanted to ask the panel, and in particular the folks that have done a review, have been on these study sections, starting with just who makes up that panel and what does that process look like behind the scenes. And maybe to bring in another face, I'll ask Dr. Garcia, maybe if you wanted to take a stab at that one.
Sure. So, these panels, at least in my experience, have a combination of, sort of the research geeks, like all of us here, maybe some clinicians that have some dangerous experience into commercialization, like Bob Taylor and Wilbur. They, from time to time, they may have, some leads of small startups, and I think those end up being very knowledgeable and help, for the most part, sort of balance the review. But it's really a diverse group of people. And just like the grants are not R01s, the review panels are not your standard review panel that you would see in a regular study section. So I think there is, the language and the evaluation is quite different than what you would have in a scientific session. So it certainly helps to sort of look at the names or who are some of the people in those panels. If I say, I made a list here, what are sort of common mistakes that I've seen in the panels? First is what Wilbur has on his background. These are not R01s. And I think the number one rookie mistake is that you have people, spending 90% of their time writing the research component and trying to impress people with the quality of the rigor of the science, and not spending sufficient time on other critical components. One, which is key, which is the time with all the crap that you got to do prior to submission. And, one of the SBIRs that we submitted, it never went out because we just failed to identify what we needed to do outside of what the university did. I think a common problem is when you have vague IP standing. I think that is something that I've seen often come up, and I think it's in your best interest to address as fully and as transparently as you can. I think another weakness is not doing a reasonable comparison with the state of the art. Somebody addressed this earlier that, saying, oh, we're a first-in-class technology. Well, that can be very, very dangerous. But if you don't discuss what are other alternatives that are there or what the competition is, I think that also hurts you a lot. I thought Steve did a great job outlining what are important components to sort of the market need and the commercialization plan. And again, I think the study section can figure out a commercialization plan that was written the night before by somebody that has a lot of experience writing R01s and have never provided depth in sort of that aspect. And a couple of SBIRs on the proposal side that I have been involved, the commercialization plans, just the language, the way it's presented, you can tell that it was written by somebody that at least has done this before or has a little more experience on it. I think that's probably enough input at this point. I don't know if others agree. Bob, you've done a lot of these panels.
Yeah, unfortunately, I had the chance to chair these several times and done about a half dozen others. And I guess one thing to point out is these are not standing study sections like regular R01 study sections, right? So to Erica's comment before, yeah, you resubmit, you're likely to get a totally different group. And in fact, there are rules depending on the institute about how many times a year you can even serve. So, you know, so don't count on the same people being there. And the other sort of wild card, I guess Andreas alluded to, is sometimes on the committee, you'll get people that have absolutely no experience with SBIRs. And like when you're chairing it, that's really challenging because they'll focus 100% on the science. And, you know, good science is not necessarily a good product. And that's a really important thing. You know, you'll have people that just go wild over some, you know, great, you know, strategy to deliver a gene to the, you know, to the heart or something. And it just has no practical value anytime in the, you know, in a million years. And I guess the other thing to be aware of is, you know, that when you, at least in heart and vascular, I'm interested in what others' experience are. So there are some places that are like factories that just crank out these SBIRs, and you'll see an almost formulary thing. There are companies that just live from like small SBIR to small SBIR, and you know, and they have it pretty organized, you know, to their advantage and to their disadvantage. And then I guess the last thing I would say is just to follow what Andrea said. You know, the commercialization plan. Obviously, for phase 1, you have to have something. You have to demonstrate validity, as Erica alluded to, that it has to be a product that's protected and can do something. But in the phase 2, boy, you know, make sure somebody who knows what they're doing has written it. And the committee, almost always in my experience, at least one of the 3 reviewers is from industry, and they will provide, you know, that expertise. And so you can't blow smoke on that one. You know, your cap table's got to be great, and you know, you've really got to know what the market is, and so at least one of those reviewers should you typically have some good knowledge. And then the other thing is just all the crazy stupid stuff that happens in study section can happen in these study sections, you know, where you get a wildcat reviewer who hates everything, and you know, all those things happen. All of those happen all the time. And I know one I chaired, gosh, there was this cardiac surgeon who just hated everything, even stuff he didn't read, you know, and those things happen. And golly, I chaired one like a year and a half later, and he was on that one too. And I just told you know, the grants person, I said, please just do not have him back again. But you know, those things happen, so you have to be prepared for the randomness of peer review.
If I can add something, I think it's really, you need to prepare yourself for a long process. And I think as it has been alluded throughout today's workshop, is, you know, some of these grants go through several submissions, resurrections, you know, 3-4 submissions on the same idea and concept, because I do think it's a little more variable than a regular study section, because you have people that don't have experience, and then you have the shifting roster of reviewers.
Yeah. Steve, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Steve. One thing that I've seen on study sections, and could vary between study sections, but a lot, you know, it's surprising how many grants come through that don't have really clear, quantifiable milestones. And that can just irk the hell out of some industry people. So you need those, you know, if you're going to do something, be able to quantify it in some way is really important for many reviewers.
You know, something some of you can consider, because the you know, the panels shift a lot. I've reached out to maybe an individual or two that's rotated off of a study section, because each, in my experience, you know, and I've served on 3 or 4 different panels for a long time, and each one had a slightly different culture, even though it may have been the same, you know, drug development type of approach. But each study section seemed to have its own kind of culture, and they vibed off of certain types of grants. Maybe I don't know why, but if you can get insight into that, it'll be helpful. And one way to do that is to perhaps have someone that's rotated off of that particular study section you've got your eyes on. You know, have them give a talk, have them give a seminar at your school, or just reach out and see if you can take a look at your grant specific aims. You know, it could be helpful.
Thanks, James. So I think one way to kind of summarize at least the last few minutes for those of you who aren't familiar with SBIRs is that the review process seems to be a little bit more random than a typical one, right? Because they're a typical R01, R21 study section, there's a roster, and 80% of the people are the same. Here, it's every time it's different, and kind of what Bob was saying, because you do have these different groups, it could be the tone of each study section can really shift depending on, for example, some of the academics on the crowd can be the loudest. So therefore the science suddenly becomes the dominating aspects of the grants. And then another study section, it could be the industry people that are the dominant voice. And then therefore it's really about the commercialization plan. I've been in ones where phase ones got shot down, even though there weren't commercialization plans in there. And by definition, you don't need a commercialization plan into phase one, but the industry guys, who again were the loudest people in the room, said, well, I at least want to know what they're thinking of, because otherwise this is just a stupid academic grant. And many grants, sunk at that study section. So these are a little bit more random, and that's something to have to consider.
Can
And
I
we've
throw in
seen,
a
we've
technical
seen
thing?
debate, Wilbur, right? Like if I'm remembering correctly, we had one grant where we proposed a study population that was in the US to replicate something happening outside of the US. And it was very clear on our comments that half of the team got it and they were saying, yes, this is a brilliant idea. The other one said, no, we don't get it. We don't like it. So it was the feedback you got. It was very polarized, but it happens too.
Yeah, Bob?
Can I throw in a technical point, and that these are not percentile, right?
Yes.
So, these, like your typical R01 gets percentiled and gets corrected from study section to study section. So you get a high scoring or low scoring study section, they can fund a lot or fund a few.
Yep.
And I've seen those waves come and go. And then the other point I'd say is, if you get a chance to serve on one of these, do it. One, not only do you get some insight into how it works, I actually found pretty good networking opportunities for me, just to, at least in the days when we used to get together. And I gather I was just asked to serve on one next year, and I'm thinking about whether I could make time to it. And that one is going to be in person, I am told, because they feel that these are important. So when they're back to being in person, they are a good networking opportunity.
Yeah, great points, Bob. And to kind of even go further on your point, depending on the institute, often the pay lines and the percentages or what's called the zone of consideration with some of the institutes, some of them aren't even published. At least for some institutes like the NHLBI, they have a very, very broad range in this zone of consideration. So you really don't know where you are. And often the program officers don't even know until they get closer to the budget committee and so forth. So it's a bad score could really kill you. And like Bob said, it doesn't even matter where the percentile is. All right. So Morgan, I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, so we're going to go to our last section before we do our wrap up here. And that is just from our experienced panel, their wisest words for grantsmanship, their shiniest pearl of wisdom. And I think we're just going to go one by one here and get each person's take. And if there's something that you want to play off another person, I think that's fine too, but we wanted to give everyone a chance to speak. I'll just go in order of what I see on my screen here, starting with you, Steve.
Yeah, I think it's been said before, but you are likely the experts on the science side, but equally important is the experts on the business side that actually make any business work, regardless of whether you're going for SBIR or not. That's well known, but just try and practice that as well. As has been said before, bring in experts that know what they're doing in this area. Bring on any opportunity that you can have with the I-Corps or other support. And also look at alternative funding. I think it's very unlikely that you can build a business, a truly successful business, just on SBIR money. I think it's very difficult. So look at it as an opportunity to go in different directions for your company if it's already existing, or to think of it as supplement to other investment opportunities that and funding opportunities. So that's what I would say.
All right, cool. Next on my screen, I have Erica. So what would you say is your wise words?
Within an SBIR or STTR, being as objective as possible is one of the better pieces that I've heard here, because it's literally a criteria we're asked right from the get-go. Is it quantifiable? Is it rigorous? That's a word that's used quite a bit. So, it's just a shorthand trick. Every single milestone I put in, it's, objective metrics of success. Literally after each one has its own section to very much show that you're focused. And, to what Rob was saying earlier on thinking about what sort of performance metrics would help you in the market, I think leveraging as much as you can the quantitative nature you already have in all of the sections of the plan will help. So that's probably the most best piece of advice, and there are many others that have been said today. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Kevin, what would you say, having seen some of these grants?
So, excuse me. So coming from the sort of university staff side as part of our tech transfer office on startups, we're here as a resource to you all and not as someone that's not a PI applying for these. I heard this mentioned during the break earlier. Conflicts are totally fine. Just let us know. We're here to help you manage them, right? So don't be worried about that, and always be in contact with tech transfer, since that can help shape your IP strategy and sort of the research you're doing in your lab, and how we can make sure that we are going after the right IP that will be useful to your company and the license that you're going to take. I also am happy to show for the I-Corps program. I know Georgia Tech also has an I-Corps lump there, but NSF traditionally has been kind of anti anything to do with biomed or healthcare unless you have like a real science or engineering component to it, because I didn't like funding things that usually go into NIH's lump. But now that NIH has its own I-Corps, yes, that's usually limited to people that are going through their SBIR STTR phase 1. But at least the UGA I-Corps site's happy to sort of run any groups through customer discovery to help you get an understanding of what your commercialization plan might look like, or get you a better understanding of what your market and your customer and your value proposition are, to help you get that early commercialization funding, either through GRA or going into your SBIR phase 1.
I wanted to just chime in a little bit. The Morehouse School of Medicine, we've got an online I-Corps course. It's 8 weeks, and you could register for it online. It's offered twice a year, so it may be a little easier to get to instead of the ones where you have to go out and meet. And it's actually taught by faculty from Georgia Tech and elsewhere.
Since you're already going, James, you want to leave us with any grantsmanship wisdom?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Cover your bases. If you have, if your project's on bladder disease, and you must have a urologist as a consultant or something. You know the science, but I've often found that the clinical significance, clinical relevance, or whatever you're addressing is super important. Similarly, have a consultant, biostatistician, whatever. If you're doing PK/PD, have a pharmacologist on board, etc. Cover your bases and try to have it reviewed ahead of time.
that often bodes very well.
Awesome. Wilbur of the ever-changing background.
Yeah, so I think this was mentioned in the very beginning, but something to really remember is as you're writing a phase 1, you should be thinking about your phase 2. So therefore, you are evaluated during your phase 2 based on how much you've done for the phase 1. So make sure that your goals, your specific aims in your phase 1 are achievable. Now that said, you don't want to have them be super boring, like, hey, I'm just going to optimize this. So you have to balance it with being scientifically interesting and rigorous, but at the same time, achievable, such that when they're evaluating you on the phase 2, you've done those things. You're able to say, check, check, check. So that's one major thing that I'd like to really accentuate.
Awesome. Rob.
I would say to make sure that you can merge your commercialization plan really with your research goals, and make sure research goals are included that consider the customer and the consumer of whatever technology that you're creating, like usability studies and things like that, that really facilitate commercialization, but live squarely in the research space.
Dr. Taylor.
Yeah, these are not exploratory grants. These are product development grants. So no hypothesis testing, no figuring things out, no having some fun science on the side. You got to be really direct on your goal, and the goal is about making a product. And don't write hypothesis in there. You can have benchmarks, you can have milestones, but no hypotheses.
Good to know. Vince.
Preparation, start early. And also, I think that we're building a little community here. And I think that engaging, with other people who have done similar things is really helpful. I've been doing a little of that, here at Emory when referring people to others, and I always get really good feedback that, oh yeah, that person really helped me, understand this process. And then the final thing I would say is that none of this, unfortunately, is cookie cutter. Everything is really tailored to those aims, and to the extent you need the sophisticated, really high-end business expertise, that may depend on where you are in marching toward the commercialization. But I really encourage all academic investigators to be open to interacting with people from different disciplines. So it's very important.
All right, and last but not least, Dr. Garcia.
Thank you. I agree with all the comments from my colleagues. I was essentially going to have a very similar comment to what Vince said. And I think, all of our institutions are very interested in fomenting and supporting these types of initiatives. So I think it is important to start early, work your networks, even across the CTSA, right? It's having an example of an SBIR that got funded for you to take a look at it and have an idea that goes a long way. Having a conversation with somebody that that has had one funded in terms of getting their wisdom on it. I think these are all very important things in preparation. And I think most people don't start working on these grants early enough. As you've heard from everybody, this is not a research grant, and it takes a lot of skill and background outside of what we are used to do. And I think, we need to recognize that up front and start early.
Awesome. With that, I think we're going to transition to Kevin and talking about his awesome new program.
Yeah, real quick before we get to that, something I didn't hear mentioned was making sure that you have a good idea of what your runway is in terms of funding. Because of how long it takes for the SBIR STTR to roll in, something like 6 to 9 months depending, you can have a gap with no funding for your company between phase 1 and phase 2. Thankfully, in the state of Georgia, we have the GRA phase 2 grant, which requires matching funding. So if you get your phase 1 there, you can use a GRA phase 2 to kind of bridge that gap. But like Erica mentioned, for their company, they were able to get, dilutive investment, and that is definitely something to look at to make sure your company doesn't sink while waiting for your phase 2 to roll in. So anyways, there was a comment from Sheba asking about different grant consultants, and a great thing that UGA just got this year is a FAST grant from the Small Business Administration. So basically, SBA is looking to raise awareness about the SBIR and STTR program, as well as increase the number and quality of grant applications from this state. So through this grant, we're looking to grant about 24 companies $3,000 to help them select and hire a grant consultant to help them with the writing and submission process for an SBIR. So I don't think I have control. Next slide, please. So yeah, here are some of the consultants back one, please. Yes. So here are some of the consultants we've spoken to. So Grant Engine, Eva Garland Consulting, and IntelliSpark. So all of these groups function off a fee system of a couple thousand upfront. So we've seen anywhere from $3,500 to $16,000, depending on phase 1 versus phase 2, as well as a success fee, 7% or lower. And depending on what agency you're applying to, you may or may not be able to put this into your company's overhead, as opposed to it coming out of that profit section. So why grant consultants? I know everyone here thinks they're great at writing grants, but I hope, as all my colleagues have mentioned, this is not your typical research grant, right? The things you're being evaluated on aren't always a science. It's all about product development. So it's very different than an R01, as Wilbur has mentioned many, many, many times. But the grant consultants do have a track record of applying for and getting these grants, and have built up a rapport with the different program officers, and might be aware of different opportunities across all the different agencies that do give SBIRs and STTRs that may be useful to you. And they're willing to engage with you early enough in the process that they can help you craft strategy for who to apply for or what different funding calls to go for. And one thing to note is some agencies, specifically NSF and USDA, do not allow you to resubmit your phase 2 if you are rejected. So that means you'd have to reapply for another phase 1 to be eligible for a phase 2. So that's something to consider when thinking about this. So as for outreach, the other part of this is raising awareness about the SBIR and STTR program. So we've done this being part of the CTSA and speaking here as part of that outreach, but we're also going to be going to some further out areas. So the UGA satellite campuses down in Tifton and Griffin. We'll also be heading out to Savannah to talk with Savannah State, as well as the Skidway Institute there, Fort Valley for Fort Valley State, and Albany for Albany State early next year, January, February 2022. So in terms of eligibility for this grant, as long as you've been to one of these outreach events, either the talk that is happening right now or the free money talk that we gave last week, you're welcome to apply. So you can find out more at startups.uga.edu/UGAFast. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. I feel like we buried the lead by putting this all the way at the end.
It's a special present for all the people that decide to stick it through.
Just stay all the way to the end.